My name is Mia Sanders. I'm 27 years old, and this happened in Big Bend National Park, Texas, during what was supposed to be a relaxing getaway with my boyfriend and his friends. I've always loved camping, but nothing prepared me for the horrors we encountered out there in the desert. We arrived at the Chisos Basin campground in the late afternoon. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the rugged cliffs. The drive had been grueling, with Lucas, my boyfriend, insisting on taking a winding, barely passable back road to add to the adventure. I was already on edge, but Lucas, always the thrill seeker, laughed off my concerns. "It's part of the charm, Mia," he said, his signature grin on full display. Jordan, his best friend, rolled his eyes from the passenger seat of the RV. "Yeah, charm," he muttered, "like breaking down in the middle of nowhere." Great idea. In the back, Clara, Jordan's younger sister, was flipping through a book on local legends. "You guys know Big Bend has a history of weird disappearances, right?" she chirped. "Like, people just vanish out here. They say it's haunted or cursed." "Thanks for the bedtime story, Clara," Jordan said, his sarcasm razor sharp. "Very helpful." I forced a smile, trying to push away the unease curling in my stomach. I wanted to enjoy this trip, reconnect with Lucas, and relax, but the desert already felt too vast, too quiet. By the time we parked the RV at the campsite, the shadows had deepened, and the air carried a strange electric stillness. The equipment issue started almost immediately. Lucas discovered the RV's water pump wasn't working. "We'll just hike to that spring we passed earlier," Lucas said casually, as though it wasn't a big deal. I shot him a look. "That's miles away, Lucas. In this heat?" "We'll manage," he replied, brushing off my concerns. The others didn't seem thrilled either, but Lucas's stubborn optimism had a way of steamrolling everyone else's objections. So we rationed what little water we had and decided to make the trek in the morning. The first night was restless. The desert wind whipped against the RV, and I kept waking to odd sounds, scratching, faint tapping, almost rhythmic. At first, I thought it was a branch scraping against the side, but when I looked out the window, there were no trees near enough to touch the RV. I didn't mention it to the others. In the morning, Clara found that some of our gear, a flashlight, and a small bag of snacks was missing. "You guys took this stuff, right?" she asked, holding up the empty bag. "Nope," Lucas said, distracted as he inspected the RV. "Probably an animal," Jordan suggested, though his tone didn't sound entirely convinced. Still, we brushed it off and started the hike to the spring. The desert heat was oppressive, sapping our energy as we trekked over rocky terrain. I could feel the tension simmering between us, everyone tired and irritable. As we approached the spring, I thought I saw movement on a ridge above us, a tall, thin figure darting between the rocks. "Did you see that?" I asked, stopping in my tracks. Lucas squinted in the direction I was pointing. "Probably a deer or something." "Looked too tall to be a deer," I muttered, but no one else seemed concerned. The spring was a small pool nestled in a shaded hollow. As we filled our bottles, Clara started talking about skinwalkers. "They're from Navajo lore," she said. "Evil witches who can shapeshift into animals or even people. They mimic voices to lure their victims." "Yeah, and they also hang out with Bigfoot," Jordan said, rolling his eyes. "You watch too much junk." "Just saying," Clara replied with a grin. "This place has that vibe, don't you think?" I didn't respond, but her words stayed with me. On the hike back, we got lost. The trail seemed to vanish, and the landmarks I thought I recognized looked different. It took hours to find our way back to the RV. By the time we did, the sun was sinking, and the same oppressive silence hung over the campsite. That night, the eerie noises returned, louder this time. Scratching, tapping, and faint whispers. I woke Lucas, but when he looked outside, there was nothing there. "You're imagining things," he said, groggy and annoyed. But I knew I wasn't. Something was out there. The third night was when everything unraveled. It started with the sound of Lucas's voice calling my name from outside the RV. "Mia," it was soft, insistent. "Come out here. I need you." I bolted upright. Lucas was lying next to me, asleep. My heart pounded as I peeked out the window. In the moonlight, I saw a shadowy figure standing just beyond the campsite, impossibly tall and thin, its eyes glowing faintly. "Mia, come here," it said again in Lucas's voice. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move but kept staring, its head tilting slightly as if studying me. "Lucas," I whispered, shaking him awake. Something's outside, he groaned, rubbing his eyes. Probably an animal. Go back to sleep. No, I hissed. It's not an animal. Look, look. When he finally looked, the figure was gone. You're stressed, he said dismissively, but I could see unease flicker across his face. The next morning, we discovered deep scratches along the RV's walls, like claw marks. Lucas tried to act unfazed, but Clara looked genuinely scared for the first time. Even Jordan didn't have a sarcastic comment. We should leave, I said, my voice firm. Lucas hesitated, then shook his head. We'll leave tomorrow morning. It's too late to start packing now. Lucas, this isn't normal. Enough, Mia, he snapped. We're fine. His stubbornness infuriated me, but I didn't push. I should have. That night, everything escalated. The tapping and scratching turned into pounding. The whispers grew louder, and now they mimicked all of us. My voice, Clara's laughter, Lucas's deep tone. It was as if the air itself carried the sound, surrounding us. At one point, Jordan screamed. He'd gone outside to investigate the noise, and we found him sitting near the edge of the campsite, trembling and pale. It was Clara, he stammered, calling me, but it wasn't her. I told you, Clara whispered, tears streaming down her face. It's a skinwalker. Lucas grabbed a knife and stepped outside, ignoring my pleas to stay inside. Come on then, he yelled into the darkness. You want to scare us? Show yourself. The wind howled, carrying that same mimicry, our voices laughing and calling out. Then we saw it. The figure emerged from the shadows, its limbs grotesquely long, its face a warped parody of human features. It moved closer, mimicking Lucas's laughter perfectly. He froze, backing up slowly. Get inside, he whispered, his bravado gone. We barricaded ourselves in the RV, but the entity didn't leave. It circled, its glowing eyes visible through the windows. It began pounding on the walls harder and harder until the whole vehicle shook. Clara dug through her bag, pulling out a small bundle of sage. We have to burn this. It's supposed to protect us. She lit the sage, the sharp herbal smell filling the air as the smoke curled around us. The pounding stopped. The figure retreated, its glowing eyes fading into the night. At dawn, we abandoned the RV and started hiking out of the canyon. The creature stalked us from the ridges above, always just out of reach, its mimic growing fainter but no less unnerving. Jordan was the first to falter. He lagged behind, muttering to himself. When we turned to check on him, he was gone. We called out for him, but all we heard was our own voices echoing back, warped and wrong. We didn't stop until we reached the ranger station, exhausted and terrified. Weeks later, a package arrived for me. Inside was Jordan's camera, with footage of his final moments. In the grainy video, he's surrounded by shadowy figures, their voices overlapping as they mimic us perfectly. I haven't camped since. The desert still haunts my dreams, and I know one thing for certain. Some places should be left alone. My name is Jackson Foreman. I'm 41 years old, and this happened a few months ago when I was camping near Devil's Sinkhole State Natural Area in Texas. It was supposed to be a simple solo trip, a chance to rediscover my love for geology and shake off the lingering bitterness of my divorce. Instead, I encountered something that I can only describe as evil, and it changed the way I see the world and myself. I arrived at the park late in the afternoon after a long and tedious drive over rocky back roads. My RV's tires groaned as I forced it through trails that probably weren't meant for anything larger than an ATV. By the time I reached the edge of the sinkhole, I'd bent a rim and lost an hour to backtracking when I took a wrong turn. Still, the view was worth it. The sinkhole stretched wide and deep in the rocky landscape, its black maw gaping under the pale Texas sky. The guidebook said it was 400 feet deep, and as I stood at the edge, staring into the void, I could believe it. Hundreds of bats emerged from the darkness, their wings slicing through the evening air like whispers of another world. I set up camp close by, just outside the official boundaries of the protected area. The no trespassing signs didn't bother me much. I wasn't planning to do anything too destructive. I just wanted a good vantage point for studying the rock formations and maybe capturing some drone footage. It was the perfect spot for inspiration, or so I thought. The first strange thing happened as I unpacked my gear. I'd brought a high-end drone to get detailed images of the sinkhole interior, but it refused to power on. I charged it the night before, but now the battery was dead. When I swapped it for a spare, the drone buzzed to life, only to lose connection as soon as I tried to fly it over the sinkhole. "Damn signal interference," I muttered, though I couldn't see anything nearby that might have caused it. I shoved the drone aside and grabbed my camera instead. As I set up my tripod, the bats began to swarm out of the sinkhole in greater numbers. I froze, staring as their flight pattern shifted into something unnervingly deliberate. For a moment, they seemed to form the shape of a hand, claws extended, before scattering into the twilight. I laughed uneasily, shaking off the feeling. "Just my imagination," I said out loud, though the words rang hollow. That night, as I lay in my RV, the silence felt heavy, almost oppressive. I was used to the stillness of remote camping, but this was different. It was too quiet, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. Then the noises started. At first, it was just a faint groaning sound, like the wind rushing through the canyon, but as I listened, the groan turned into something deeper, almost like a voice. It was low and guttural, resonating from the direction of the sinkhole. "Jackson!" I sat up straight, my heart pounding. The sound was faint but unmistakable. It was my name. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the area. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but rocks and dry scrub. Still, the voice lingered in the back of my mind, as though it had edged itself into my thoughts. I told myself it was just the wind, just my imagination. But I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I found something unusual near the edge of the sinkhole. Partially buried in the dirt was an old, weathered book. Its leather cover was cracked and faded, but the pages inside were intact, filled with strange symbols and passages in a language I couldn't recognize. It looked ancient, and as I flipped through it, I felt a strange unease settle over me. The symbols seemed to shift on the page, their shapes warping and twisting as though they were alive. I should have left it there. I should have walked away. But curiosity got the better of me. I brought the book back to the RV, intending to research it later. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the noises started again. This time they were louder, marked. The voice was clearer now, echoing from the direction of the sinkhole. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, heavy and malevolent. I stepped outside, clutching my flashlight, and froze. Near the edge of the sinkhole stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with horns that curved against the sky and eyes that glowed like embers. "Who's there?" I called, though my voice wavered. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me with those burning eyes. Then it raised one clawed hand and pointed to the book sitting on the RV's table. I backed away, my heart racing. The figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving only the echo of its voice. "Jackson!" The next few hours were a blur of panic and confusion. The voice grew louder now, coming from all around me. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, too quick to catch, but too real to ignore. The RV's lights flickered wildly, plunging me into darkness before flaring back to life. Desperate for answers, I grabbed the book and began flipping through its pages. The symbols seemed to pulse, their shapes growing sharper and more menacing. My hands trembled as I tried to make sense of the cryptic passages, but the language was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Then the shadows became solid. Figures emerged from the darkness, their forms twisted and flickering like flames. They surrounded the RV, their eyes glowing red, their mouths whispering my name over and over. "Jackson! Jackson! Jackson!" I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the book and ran outside, the cold desert air biting at my skin. The figures closed in, their whispers growing into a deafening roar. "What do you want?" I screamed, clutching the book to my chest. The towering figure appeared again, rising from the sinkhole like a shadow brought to life. Its voice boomed, shaking the ground beneath my feet. "You disturbed my domain," it said, its words cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You brought the book. You must pay the price." Its clawed hand reached for me, and I stumbled back, my mind racing. Then I remembered something, a line from an old myth about curses and spirits. "Burn the tether, and the curse will break." I didn't know if it would work, but I didn't have a choice. I grabbed my lighter, flicked it on, and held the flame to the book. The pages ignited, the fire spreading quickly as the symbols writhed and twisted in agony. The figures screamed, their forms dissolving into smoke as the book burned. The towering entity howled, its voice shaking the air before vanishing into the darkness. When it was over, I collapsed to the ground, trembling and gasping for breath. The desert was silent again. The oppressive weight lifted. I didn't wait for dawn. I packed up what I could and left the park, abandoning the RV when it refused to start. I don't know what I encountered at Devil's Sinkhole, but I'll never forget it. The images from that trip, the ones I managed to recover, show things I can't explain. Shadows that shouldn't be there, shapes that defy reason. I've shared my story with a few people, but most don't believe me. Maybe I don't want them to. Some truths are better left buried. My name is Sophia Saunders, and I'm 33 years old. This happened last spring when I decided to take a solo RV trip into the heart of Sam Houston National. I'd been looking for some peace and quiet, a break from my messy divorce and the chaos of my life as a former school teacher turned struggling writer. I thought the isolation would help me focus on my memoir. Instead, it became the most horrifying experience of my life. I arrived at the campground in the early afternoon, parking my RV in a clearing that was about as remote as I could find. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their thick canopies blocking out most of the sunlight. I hadn't seen another camper since I turned off the main road, and that suited me just fine. I wanted solitude. After setting up camp, I took a short walk to explore the area. The forest was beautiful in a haunting kind of way. Tall pines rising like columns, their bark dark and weathered. There was a quietness to the place that felt both calming and oppressive, like the world had forgotten it existed. As I was heading back to the RV, I noticed an old, run-down cabin hidden among the trees. It looked abandoned, but as I got closer, I saw movement inside. A figure, small and hunched, peering out at me through a cracked window. A woman stepped out, her gray hair wild and unkempt. She wore a faded flannel shirt and jeans that were torn at the knees. "Don't see many folks out here," she said, her voice raspy. "You camping alone?" "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "Just here to write and get away for a bit." She narrowed her eyes at me, her face shadowed by the brim of a tattered hat. "You shouldn't wander too deep into the woods, especially at night." I raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" She didn't answer right away, just glanced over her shoulder toward the trees. "This forest has stories," she said finally. "Lost children, people who go missing. Just be careful." I nodded politely, but her words lingered in my mind as I walked back to the RV. Something about her tone, half warning, half regret, left me unsettled. The first night passed uneventfully. I spent the evening writing by the dim glow of my laptop, the only sounds the occasional rustle of wind in the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. It was the kind of quiet I'd been craving. But the second night was different. It started with laughter, faint, high-pitched giggling like children playing. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The sound was coming from outside, near the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal, but something about it didn't feel right. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of the pines and the undergrowth below. The laughter stopped. The forest was still. I was about to head back inside when I noticed something in the dirt. Small footprints leading away from the RV and into the trees. They looked like they belonged to a child, but they were too perfect, too well preserved for the soft, uneven ground. It was as if they'd been placed there deliberately. The next day, I tried to shake off the unease by going for a hike. I stuck to a marked trail, but even in the daylight the forest felt oppressive. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches tangling overhead like skeletal fingers. As I walked, I heard something, a soft, melodic singing carried on the wind. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder as I moved deeper into the woods. The tune was hauntingly familiar, like a nursery rhyme I couldn't quite place, but the words were wrong, jumbled and nonsensical. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The singing stopped. The forest was silent again. That was when I saw them. 3 children stood in the shadows, their faces pale and their clothes old-fashioned, faded dresses and suspenders that looked like they belonged in another century. They didn't move, just stared at me with wide, dark eyes that didn't seem to reflect the light. "Are you lost?" I asked, stepping closer. Where are your parents? The smallest of the three, a girl no older than 6, tilted her head and smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was too wide, too deliberate. Mother will find us, she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper, but it carried through the still air like a shout. I hurried back to the RV, my heart pounding. By the time I reached the clearing, the children were gone. I tried to convince myself that they were just local kids playing a prank, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, I locked all the doors and windows and kept the lights on. The laughter returned, louder this time, circling the RV like a taunt. I could hear small hands tapping on the windows, followed by faint giggles that sent chills down my spine. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I decided to leave. I'd had enough of the forest and its strange inhabitants. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine wouldn't turn over. I checked the battery, the fuel, everything seemed fine, but it just wouldn't start. That's when Maggie appeared again, emerging from the trees like a ghost. She walked up to the RV and tapped on the driver's side window. "You need to leave," she said. When I opened the door, "I'm trying," I said, my voice shaking. "It won't start." Her expression darkened. "They won't let you leave. Not until they're done with you." I stared at her, my pulse racing. "Who? The children?" She nodded. "They were taken years ago." "By her?" I asked. Maggie didn't answer. Instead, she handed me a small bundle of dried herbs and a rusted iron horseshoe. "Burn the sage. Keep the iron close. It's the only way to keep her at bay." That night, the children returned. This time, they didn't stay outside. I woke to the sound of footsteps inside the RV, small and deliberate, moving from one end to the other. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, clutching the horseshoe Maggie had given me. "Mother wants you," a voice whispered close to my ear. I turned, but there was no one there. The children's laughter echoed through the RV, joined by a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Desperate, I lit the bundle of sage and waved it around, the smoke filling the small space. The laughter turned to screams, high and shrill, as the children's figures appeared and dissolved like shadows in the mist. But it wasn't over. The final confrontation came at dawn. As the first light filtered through the trees, I saw her standing at the edge of the clearing, near an old, overgrown well. She was tall and thin, her face obscured by a tangle of black hair. Her arms stretched unnaturally long, ending in clawed fingers that scraped against the stone rim of the well. The children stood around her, their eyes blank and their mouths open in silent screams. "Come," she said, her voice a low, guttural rasp. "Join my family." I held up the horseshoe, and she recoiled, hissing like a wild animal. The children lunged toward me, their hands clawing at the air, but the sage smoke kept them at bay. Summoning every ounce of courage, I threw the horseshoe toward the well. As it clanged against the stone, the woman let out an ear-splitting scream, and the children dissolved into mist. The forest just fell silent. By the time I got the RV started, the sun was fully up. I didn't look back as I drove away, my hands trembling on the wheel. I never wrote about what happened in Sam Houston National Forest. It was too personal, too real. But sometimes in the dead of night I still hear their laughter, faint and far away, and I wonder if I truly escaped. My name is Jacob Foreman, and I'm 31 years old. Last spring, I decided to take a solo RV trip through Texas to clear my head. This happened in Devil's Sinkhole State Natural Area, a remote place I chose because it sounded like the perfect spot for solitude and inspiration. I never believed in ghost stories or superstitions, but that trip changed everything. It started out like any other camping adventure. I arrived at the park late in the afternoon and set up my RV at the closest designated camping area near the famous sinkhole. The Devil's Sinkhole is a massive limestone cavern that drops over 300 feet into the earth. It's known for its bat colonies, and every evening thousands of bats emerge in a swirling mass, a sight I hope to capture for my blog. The place was eerily quiet, but I didn't mind. Solitude was the whole point of the trip. As I parked my RV, I noticed another vehicle pulling up, a green park ranger's truck. A woman stepped out, mid-40s, with a weathered face that looked like it had seen more than its share of sun and wind. "You're here alone?" she asked, her tone more curious than accusatory. I nodded. "Yeah, just me. I'm documenting the park for my blog." She gave me a look, not unkind but cautious. "Don't stay out too late," she said. "This place has its stories." I smiled, assuming she meant coyotes or other wildlife. "I'll be careful." Her eyes lingered on me for a moment before she added, "Be sure to leave before sundown tomorrow. The Devil's Caravan comes through here at night." I laughed, thinking she was joking, but her expression didn't change. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Just don't stay past sundown," she said, then climbed back into her truck and drove off, leaving me with a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. The first signs of trouble came that evening. I'd planned to use the RV's generator to charge my camera and other equipment, but about an hour before sunset, the generator sputtered and died. I tried restarting it several times, but nothing worked. My backup battery pack wouldn't turn on either, and my phone signal had vanished entirely. I decided to make the best of it. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out to the sinkhole to watch the bats. It was an incredible sight, thousands of them spiraling into the sky like a living tornado. But as I stood there, taking it all in, I thought I heard something else. A faint whisper at first. I told myself it was just the wind echoing through the canyon, but the sound grew louder. It wasn't words exactly, just a low rhythmic murmur like chanting. I shined my flashlight toward the sinkhole, but there was nothing there. The bats had all flown off, leaving the area in an oppressive silence. That was when I saw the shadows. They appeared on the ground near the edge of the sinkhole, tall and humanoid, but there was nothing nearby to cast them. My heart raced as I scanned the area with my flashlight. The shadows didn't move, but they didn't vanish either. I told myself it was just a trick of the light and hurried back to the RV. That night, the real horror began. It started with the sound of wheels. At first, it was faint, like an old wagon rolling over gravel. I sat up in bed, listening. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the soft clip-clop of hooves. I peeked out the RV window, expecting to see a group of late-night campers, but what I saw froze me in place. A caravan of wagons was moving through the fog, illuminated by an eerie bluish glow. The wagons looked ancient, their wooden wheels creaking under their weight. Shadowy figures rode skeletal horses, their faces obscured by darkness. I wanted to believe it was some kind of historical reenactment or hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The caravan moved silently, the figures turning their heads toward my RV as they passed. Then one of them stopped. A tall, shadowy rider dismounted from his spectral horse and began walking toward the RV. His movements were slow but deliberate, like he knew I was watching. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in short gasps. The figure stopped just outside the RV, his glowing red eyes piercing through the darkness. "Jacob," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "You've traveled far. Come with us." My blood turned to ice. I don't remember how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear. The figure didn't move, but his presence was suffocating, as if the air itself had thickened. Finally, I forced myself to speak. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure tilted his head, almost amused. "I am the conductor of the caravan. We travel these lands seeking those who are lost. Join us, and you will be free of your burdens." His words sent a chill down my spine. They weren't just words, they were images and emotions invading my mind. I saw flashes of myself wandering endlessly through deserts and forests untethered from time. It was tempting, in a strange, horrifying way, but something inside me pushed back. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm not going anywhere with you." The conductor's eyes narrowed. "You resist, but you will join us. All travelers do in time." He raised a hand, and the RV shook violently. The lights flickered, and a horrible scraping sound filled the air, like nails on metal. I grabbed my wallet instinctively, pulling out a small iron cross my grandmother had given me years ago. When I held it up, the conductor recoiled, his figure wavering like smoke in the wind. The caravan began to fade, the wagons dissolving into the fog. "You cannot escape us," the conductor said, his voice echoing as he disappeared. "We will return." The next morning, I left Devil's Sinkhole as quickly as possible. My RV started without issue, as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When I got back to civilization, I tried to research the Devil's Caravan, but all I found were vague references to ghostly wagons and lost souls. No one seemed to know the full story, and part of me was relieved. I didn't include the experience in my blog. Who would believe me? But even now, months later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, and when the room is quiet enough, I think I can still hear the creaking of wagon wheels. This is my story, for whatever it's worth. If you're ever near Devil's Sinkhole, be careful, and whatever you do, don't stay past sundown. My name is Logan Stewart. I'm 30 years old, and this happened just 6 months ago. I was on assignment for a magazine, writing about myths and legends tied to Florida's wilderness. I've always thought of myself as grounded and practical, a skeptic really. But my trip to Myakka River State Park changed that forever. It was Eric's idea to begin with. He was my oldest friend, a year younger than me, 27, and completely obsessed with the paranormal. While I loved nature and photography, Eric loved ghost stories, cryptids, and chasing legends. When I told him I was writing about Florida's Bigfoot, the skunk ape, he lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. "You have to go to Myakka," Eric said, grinning through the phone. "It's prime territory. There are sightings all the time." I wasn't sold, but he was persistent. He even offered to come along, promising he'd help with interviews and filming. Reluctantly, I agreed. We pulled into the park late on a humid Friday afternoon. The RV groaned as we found a spot near the edge of the campground. Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks, and the air smelled like damp earth and decaying leaves. Eric was giddy, practically bouncing as we unpacked our gear. "This is perfect," he said, snapping photos with his phone. "I can feel it. Something's out here." "You're insane," I replied, rolling my eyes. "This is just another swamp." That night, we cooked over a small fire and swapped stories with a couple from the neighboring campsite. They shared some local folklore, but nothing particularly scary. Eric brought up the skunk ape, and they laughed. "People say they see it, but it's just gators or bears," the husband said, "or tourists who drank too much." By the time we settled into the RV, the temperature had dropped slightly and the forest had gone quiet, too quiet. As I drifted off to sleep, I could hear the faint hum of crickets outside, punctuated by the occasional rustle of leaves. The next morning, we set out on a trail that wound deep into the swamp. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting long, shifting shadows on the muddy ground. Eric was armed with his camera and a notebook full of local legends. I focused on my own camera, snapping shots of the eerie, moss-covered trees and the still, glassy water. About an hour in, we found the deer carcass. It was fresh. Too fresh. The poor animal's ribs jutted out like broken ivory, and its hindquarters looked half-eaten, but there were no tracks, no signs of a predator, just the carcass lying in the middle of the trail, and those strange, jagged claw marks running across its flank. "Logan," Eric whispered, kneeling to examine it. "This isn't right." "It's probably a gator," I said, though I wasn't convinced. Gators didn't leave claw marks like that. Eric pulled out his camera, snapping pictures. "I bet it's a skunk ape. They hunt deer, right?" I groaned and walked ahead, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. As the day went on, things got stranger. My camera batteries, fully charged that morning, drained within hours. Eric's flashlight, which he hadn't even used, began flickering erratically. The air felt heavier, pressing down on my chest, and every so often I caught the faintest whiff of something rancid, like rotting meat. By the time we reached the campsite that evening, I was exhausted and irritable. Eric, however, was thrilled. He claimed he'd seen something, a tall, shadowy figure slipping between the trees. I dismissed it as his overactive imagination, but when he showed me the blurry photo on his camera, I couldn't deny it looked wrong. The figure was humanoid but distorted, with elongated limbs and a head that seemed too large for its body. "You're messing with me," I said, though my voice wavered. Eric just smirked. "You saw the deer, man. Something's out here." That night, I woke to a strange sound, soft, deliberate tapping. At first, I thought it was rain, but as I blinked into the darkness, I realized it was coming from the RV window. "Eric!" I hit him, nudging him awake. "Did you hear that?" He groaned and sat up, rubbing his eyes. The tapping stopped for a moment. The silence was deafening. Then something scratched the side of the RV, slow and deliberate, like nails dragging across metal. "Probably raccoons," Eric muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. We stayed up the rest of the night. the small fire outside casting flickering shadows across the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us just beyond the firelight. The next morning, Eric wanted to explore deeper into the swamp. I was hesitant, but he convinced me to give it one more shot. As we hiked, the forest grew denser, the air thick with humidity. That's when we heard it, a voice calling my name. Logan! It sounded like Eric, but he was standing right beside me. Did you hear that? I asked, my heart pounding. Eric nodded, his face pale. It's not me, man. I swear. We quickened our pace, but the voice followed us, echoing through the trees. Then it changed. It wasn't just calling my name anymore. It was laughing. The sound was high-pitched and unnatural, like a mocking cackle. By the time we made it back to the RV, the sun was setting. Eric was panicked, muttering about wendigos, creatures from Native American legend that mimicked voices to lure their prey. I tried to stay calm, but the dread in my chest was impossible to ignore. We built a large bonfire and sat close to it, hoping the light would keep whatever it was at bay. As the fire crackled, I saw it. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. It was tall, impossibly thin, with glowing eyes and a skull-like face. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Stay back!" Eric shouted, tossing a burning stick toward it. The creature didn't flinch. It just circled us, its glowing eyes never leaving our faces. Eric snapped, grabbed a flashlight, and charged toward the creature, yelling at me to stay put. "Eric, don't!" I shouted, but he was already gone, disappearing into the darkness. For what felt like hours, I sat alone by the fire, clutching the largest stick I could find. The creature didn't follow Eric. It stayed close, watching me, its head tilting as if studying my fear. Eventually, the first rays of dawn broke through the trees and the creature melted back into the shadows. I called for Eric, but there was no answer. When the park rangers arrived, they found nothing. No sign of Eric, no tracks, nothing to explain the scratches on the RV or the whispers in the swamp. They chalked it up to an accident, a tragic case of someone getting lost in the wilderness. But I knew better. I left Myakka that day, but the memories followed me. I still hear Eric's voice sometimes, faint and far away, calling my name in the dead of night. I never went back to finish the article. Some truths are better left untold. My name is Henry Bennett. I'm 33 years old, and this happened in Caprock Canyon State Park, Texas, about 6 months ago. I'd planned a solo camping trip to photograph the park's famous bison herds and rugged landscapes, hoping to create a portfolio that might revive my struggling career as a wildlife photographer. It was supposed to be a fresh start, but it turned into something else entirely. It's not easy to talk about, and even now, I'm not sure if what happened was real. All I know is I left Caprock Canyons with scars I can't explain and images I didn't take. I arrived at Caprock in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low over the crimson cliffs. The road twisted through towering rock formations and open grasslands dotted with bison. It was exactly the kind of untouched beauty I'd been hoping to capture. I parked my RV at a remote campsite near the North Prong trailhead. I wanted isolation, and I got it. My nearest neighbors were miles away. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the dry grass. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first sign that something wasn't right came almost immediately after setting up camp. I noticed my RV's battery wasn't charging. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. "Great," I muttered, grabbing a flashlight. "I guess it's just me in the dark." I shrugged it off. I'd dealt with worse equipment problems before. Besides, the RV wasn't essential. I could manage with my camera gear and a good campfire. But as I sat outside that evening, the fire casting long shadows across the red rocks, I had the distinct feeling I wasn't alone. It started with the footsteps, soft, deliberate, circling just beyond the edge of the firelight. I held my breath, listened, but saw nothing when I shone the flashlight into the darkness. Probably a bison, I told myself, or a deer. The thought wasn't comforting. The next day, I set out early to explore the trails. The park was even more beautiful than I'd imagined, the red cliffs rising against a brilliant blue sky. But as I hiked, something felt off. The first strange thing I noticed was the rock formations. They were jagged and angular, like natural spires, but they seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. It was subtle, just a shadow in the wrong place or a formation that looked taller than it had a moment before. I chalked it up to fatigue. I hadn't been sleeping well. Still, the feeling of unease lingered. Around noon, I came across a small hidden corner of the park, a space that seemed untouched by time. There was an old, weathered plaque near the base of a cliff. The words were barely legible, but I managed to make out the gist. In memory of the unnamed woman accused of witchcraft and executed by settlers, 1871. She cursed this land with her dying breath, vowing to haunt all who disturb it. I laughed nervously, taking a picture of the plaque. "That'll make for an interesting caption," I muttered, but the hair on my arm stood up as I read the words again. That night, the footsteps returned, louder this time, accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I sat frozen in the RV, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, I saw nothing but shadows. I tried to sleep, but my dreams were worse. I saw a woman, her face obscured by a tangle of black hair, standing in the middle of a canyon. Her dress was tattered, her eyes glowing red. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. I woke drenched in sweat, the whispers still echoing in my ears. By the third day, I was ready to leave, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. No power, no escape. I spent the afternoon hiking to higher ground, hoping for cell service, but my phone refused to connect. As I trudged back to camp, the wildlife began acting strangely. A bison stood in the middle of the trail, blocking my path. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, and it didn't move, even when I waved my arms and shouted. Eventually, I had to detour around it, the weight of its stare pressing into my back. The birds were worse. They gathered in clusters, perched on the rocks around my campsite, watching me in eerie silence. When I tried to shoo them away, they didn't budge. That evening, the storm rolled in. Thunder rumbled across the canyon, and lightning illuminated the cliffs in stark, jagged flashes. I huddled inside the RV, listening as the whispers grew louder, almost conversational. My name floated through the air, spoken in a soft, unfamiliar voice. "Henry." I froze, my breath catching. The voice came again, closer this time. "Henry, come outside." I didn't move. My heart thundered in my chest as I gripped the flashlight and stared at the door. The whisper turned to a knock, soft at first, then louder, insistent. Bang, bang, bang. I shouted, "Who's there?" but got no response. The knocking stopped, replaced by laughter, low and guttural, like it was coming from the depths of the earth. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my camera, determined to document whatever was happening, and stepped outside. The storm had transformed the canyon into a surreal landscape. The wind howled, and the rain came in sheets, but I barely noticed. My eyes were locked on the figure standing at the edge of the firelight. It was the woman from my dreams. She was gaunt and skeletal, her eyes glowing like embers. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear over the wind. I raised the camera, snapping photo after photo, but she didn't react. Slowly, she lifted one hand and pointed to a small pile of stones near the base of the cliffs. I don't know why I followed her gesture, but I did. Beneath the stones, I found a crude shrine, a bundle of twigs and bones bound together with what looked like human hair. My stomach turned, but I couldn't look away. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. The woman was gone. When I returned to the RV, the whispers remained. They filled the air, growing louder, more frantic, until I thought I would lose my mind. Desperate, I remembered the plaque, "The Witch's Curse." I grabbed one of my photographs, the best one I'd taken of the park, and lit it with my campfire. The whispers stopped. The air went still. For a moment, I thought it was over. But as I packed my things, I noticed something strange. The photos I'd taken that day were distorted, filled with shadows and shapes that hadn't been there before. One image stood out, a figure standing on the ridge, her eyes glowing red. I left Caprock Canyons at dawn, abandoning my RV and hiking until I reached the main road. A park ranger found me hours later, dehydrated and delirious. I didn't tell him what happened. The photos from that trip gained me some recognition, but I can't take pride in it. Every time I look at them, I feel her eyes watching me, and I hear the whispers again. I haven't been back to the canyons, and I never will. Some places are better left forgotten. My name is Luke Phillips, and I'm 32 years old. This happened in October of last year, and even now I can barely bring myself to think about it. I don't know why I suggested Devil's Backbone for that camping trip. Maybe it was the thrill of the unknown, maybe just the lure of a good story. Whatever the reason, it's a decision I'll regret for the rest of my life. It started as an innocent idea. I was scrolling through articles about haunted places in Texas and stumbled upon Devil's Backbone, a winding ridge in the hill country, infamous for ghost sightings and eerie legends. I thought it'd make the perfect backdrop for a weekend camping trip. As a photographer, I couldn't resist the idea of capturing the misty trails and shadowy landscapes. Jason, my boyfriend of 5 years, wasn't thrilled but agreed. "This is just another one of your spooky obsessions," he teased as we loaded the RV. At 32, Jason prided himself on being the skeptic, the grounded one. He was coming along to humor me, or so he claimed. Lisa, my best friend since college, was the opposite. At 28, she had a deeply spiritual side and was fascinated by the paranormal. "I can feel places," she always said. She brought along her new boyfriend, Evan. I didn't know much about him except that he was quiet, outdoorsy, and seemed to have a dark edge, like he'd seen things he didn't talk about. We set out early on a Friday morning, the RV loaded with supplies, cameras, and hiking gear. The drive through the hill country was gorgeous, rolling hills, golden grass, and patches of dense forest. As we wound our way up the backbone, I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. The ridge had a way of playing tricks on your eyes. Shadows shifted in the trees, and the horizon seemed to ripple with heat, even though it wasn't that warm. "This place is beautiful," Lisa said, leaning out of the window to take a picture, "but it feels heavy." Jason rolled his eyes. "It feels like any other ridge in Texas." Evan said nothing, just stared out the window with a furrowed brow. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon. The spot was secluded with a view of the ridge and the sprawling valley below. As we set up, Lisa wandered off to explore, and I busied myself with my camera. The golden hour was breathtaking, the light filtering through the trees like something out of a dream. "Come look at this," Lisa called from the edge of the clearing. Jason and I joined her, and she pointed to a cluster of rocks etched with strange symbols. They looked ancient, jagged, and deliberate. "Probably just graffiti," Jason said, brushing it off. But Evan frowned. "They're warnings," he muttered. When we pressed him, he clammed up, saying, "It's nothing, just folklore." That night, as we sat around the campfire, the atmosphere shifted. The usual chirping of insects and rustling of leaves seemed to fade, replaced by an unnatural stillness. Even Jason noticed it. "Too quiet," he said, poking at the fire. "Where's all the wildlife?" Lisa stared into the flames. "They know something's wrong." I laughed nervously, trying to shake the tension. "Come on, it's just a quiet night. Let's tell ghost stories." We stayed up late, swapping tales and drinking. It wasn't until everyone had gone to bed that I heard it, the faint sound of whispering just beyond the RV. At first, I thought it was Lisa or Evan, but when I peeked outside, there was no one there, just the darkness pressing against the clearing. I told myself it was the wind. The next morning, we decided to hike to one of the overlooks. Jason took the lead, map in hand, while Lisa and I trailed behind, snapping pictures. Evan walked silently at the back, his eyes darting to every shadow. The trail was tougher than we expected, steep and rocky. The air felt thicker the higher we climbed, as if the ridge was trying to push us back. About halfway up, Jason stopped. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing ahead. I squinted and saw what he meant, a dark figure standing on the trail, motionless. At first I thought it was another hiker, but something about it was off. The proportions seemed wrong, the limbs too long, the stance unnatural. "Probably just a tree or something," Jason said, but his voice wavered. As we got closer, the figure was gone. The trail ahead was empty. Lisa grabbed my arm. "I don't like this. We should go back." "We're almost at the top," Jason said, forging ahead. "It's fine." We reached the overlook just as the fog rolled in, thick and sudden. The valley below disappeared into a sea of white. I took out my camera, hoping to capture the eerie beauty, but my hands were shaking. The atmosphere was oppressive, like the ridge itself was watching us. As we descended, Jason veered off the trail, saying he saw something he wanted to check out. We waited for him, but when he didn't come back, panic set in. Lisa started calling his name, her voice echoing into the fog. When Jason finally reappeared, he was pale and disoriented. I was only gone for a minute, he said, but according to my watch, he'd been missing for nearly an hour. That night, everything unraveled. The RV's generator failed, leaving us in darkness, and Jason's phone glitched, the screen flickering before dying completely. Lisa was pacing, muttering about the symbols and how they'd felt like a warning. Evan sat by the fire, staring into the flames, his face tense. "I need to tell you something," he said finally, his voice low, almost a whisper. "When I was a kid, my brother and I camped near here. He heard something calling his name in the woods and went to check it out. We found him the next morning, but he wasn't whole. We moved away after that." Lisa's eyes widened. "You think it's the same thing?" Evan nodded. "The locals say it's a skinwalker, mimics voices, draws people in, and feeds on their fear." Jason scoffed. "Come on, Evan, you're seriously buying into this?" But then the whisper started again, louder this time, circling the RV. Lisa froze, her face pale. "That's my voice," she said. "It's calling my name." I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. The beam cut through the darkness, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, its body twisted and wrong, its face featureless, but its eyes glowed faintly in the dark. I stumbled back inside, locking the door. "We're not safe here," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to leave." We decided to hike out at dawn, leaving the RV behind, but the ridge had other plans. As we made our way down the trail, the fog thickened and the whispers grew louder. At one point, Jason swore he saw Lisa up ahead, even though she was right next to me. He ran toward the figure, ignoring our shouts, and disappeared into the mist. When we found him, he was bleeding from shallow cuts across his chest, his clothes torn. He couldn't explain what had happened. Evan lit a makeshift torch, using it to keep the creature at bay as we pressed on. He whispered something under his breath, prayers maybe, or chants, and the whispers seemed to falter. When the trail finally opened up onto the road, I felt a wave of relief, but as I turned back, I saw it one last time, a shadowy figure standing on the ridge, watching us. We made it out alive, but none of us were the same. Jason stopped dismissing the supernatural, but he doesn't talk about what happened. Lisa refuses to camp anymore, and Evan moved back to the city, far from any wilderness. As for me, I deleted every photo I took that weekend, afraid they might carry some trace of the thing that stalked us. If you ever visit Devil's Backbone, don't ignore the whispers, and if something calls your name, don't answer. My name is Gabriel Jacobs, and I'm 37 years old. This happened about 6 months ago, though it feels like yesterday. I was at a breaking point in my life, still reeling from the loss of my wife, Rebecca. She'd been gone for a year, but the grief clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I thought a solo camping trip to Davy Crockett National Forest might help. The peace and solitude would let me clear my head, or so I thought. The forest was stunning. Towering pines stretched endlessly toward the sky, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into soft golden beams. I pulled my RV into a remote campsite, far from the busier areas. Solitude was what I needed. I didn't want kids on bikes zipping past or couples chatting around their campfires. Just me, the trees, and the open air. After setting up camp, I decided to take a short walk and familiarize myself with the area. The forest was alive with sound. The rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the occasional creak of a swaying tree. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd hoped for. But as I ventured deeper, a strange unease settled over me. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker. I shrugged it off and headed back to the RV before nightfall. Later that evening, as I sat by my campfire, I heard a voice behind me. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" Startled, I turned to see an older man standing just outside the firelight. He looked to be in his 70s, with a wiry frame and a face weathered by years of outdoor living. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said, stepping closer. "Name's Clean. I live near the forest's edge." "Gabriel," I replied, shaking his hand. We chatted for a bit, mostly small talk about the forest and camping. Then out of nowhere he said, "You hear the whispers yet?" I frowned. "Whispers?" He nodded, his expression serious. "The pines, they talk to some folks. Most don't listen, but those who do. Well, they don't always make it back. I chuckled nervously, unsure if he was joking or just trying to spook me. I'll keep that in mind. Do more than that, he said. If you hear something calling your name, don't follow it, and whatever you do, don't stay out after dark. With that, he tipped his hat and disappeared into the trees, after leaving me alone with a fire that suddenly felt far too small. That night, I lay awake in the RV, Clean's words replaying in my mind. The forest outside was silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. And then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the hum of the night. Gabriel! I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. It was probably the wind, I told myself. Just the wind. But the voice came again, softer this time, as if it were right outside the RV. Gabriel. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the darkness. The forest was still, the trees casting long, eerie shadows in the moonlight. I saw nothing, but the whispering continued, circling me, always just out of reach. Forcing myself to breathe, I retreated to the RV and locked the door. It was a long time before I fell asleep. The next day, I decided to explore deeper into the forest, hoping to shake the uneasy feeling from the night before. The sunlight filtering through the pines was reassuring, and I soon found myself lost in the beauty of the trails. About an hour in, I came across a narrow, overgrown path I hadn't seen on the map. It was marked by strange symbols carved into the bark of the trees, circles, lines, and jagged shapes that didn't look random. Against my better judgment, I followed the trail. The further I went, the quieter the forest became. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that pressed down on me like a weight. Then I heard the whispers again. Gabriel, help me. I froze. It was Rebecca's voice, clear and unmistakable. My throat tightened, and I spun around, searching for the source. Nothing. Just the endless trees. Gabriel, the voice was closer now, pleading. Please. I stumbled forward, desperate to find her, even though I knew it couldn't be real. Rebecca was gone. I'd seen her buried, and yet her voice was here, drawing me deeper into the forest. I don't know how long I wandered before I found the cabin. It was old, its wooden walls warped and rotting, half hidden among the trees. I approached cautiously, the whispers swirling around me like a sinister wind. Inside, the air was stifling. The walls were covered in carvings similar to the symbols I'd seen on the trees, but these were more intricate, almost ritualistic. In the corner, I found a tattered journal. The pages were filled with frantic scrawls describing voices, shadows, and people who'd vanished without a trace. They lure you in, one entry read. They make you see what you want to see, hear what you want to hear. Don't follow them. Don't listen. A creak behind me sent a jolt of terror through my body. I spun around, but the doorway was empty. The whispers, however, were louder now, more insistent. Gabriel, come back to me. Rebecca's voice. I ran from the cabin, my heart pounding. The forest seemed alive, the trees closing in around me, the whispers echoing from every direction. I couldn't tell where I was going, only that I had to get away. As night fell, the whispers turned to laughter, soft, mocking, and inhuman. I stumbled into a clearing, my legs trembling, and saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was Rebecca, or something that looked like her. She smiled, her eyes glinting in the moonlight. You found me, she said, her voice warm and familiar. Come closer. I took a step forward, tears streaming down my face, but something in the back of my mind screamed at me to stop. This wasn't Rebecca. It couldn't be. Who are you? I demanded, my voice shaking, the smile twisted into something monstrous. Don't you recognize me, Gabriel? I've been waiting for you. The figure dissolved into shadow, its form shifting and stretching until it became something unrecognizable, a towering mass of darkness with glowing eyes, surrounded by the sound of countless voices whispering in unison. I scrambled back, fumbling with the lighter in my pocket. My hand brushed against a bundle of dried sage I'd picked up earlier in town. Clean had said something about its protective properties, though I hadn't believed him at the time. With shaking hands, I lit the sage and held it out in front of me. The entity recoiled, the whispers turning into a deafening roar. The flames seemed to weaken it, the shadows retreating as I waved the burning sage. Leave me alone, I shouted, my voice echoing through the clearing. The entity let out a final guttural howl before vanishing into the darkness. The forest fell silent. At dawn, I found my way back to the RV, guided by some unseen force. Clean was waiting at the edge of the campsite, his expression grim but unsurprised. "You made it," he said simply. I nodded, too exhausted to speak. "Not everyone does," he added. "The forest let you go. Don't push your luck." I left Davy Crockett National Forest that morning, the towering pines shrinking in the rearview mirror. I haven't been camping since, and I doubt I ever will. Some places aren't meant to be understood, only respected. And if you ever find yourself in the Whispering Pines, don't listen to the voices. Whatever you hear, it isn't real. At least I hope it isn't. My name is David Howell, and I'm 37 years old. I've spent most of my life as a travel nurse, moving from one high-pressure hospital to another. The work takes its toll, so every few months I pack up my RV and head somewhere remote to recharge. That's how I ended up in the Hawk Valley last summer. I thought it would be peaceful, a chance to escape the chaos. I was wrong. It started like any other trip. I parked my RV in a clearing near the Hoosac Tunnel, just outside North Adams, Massachusetts. The tunnel, nicknamed the Bloody Pit, had a grim history. Over 200 men died during its construction in the 1800s, some buried alive after a catastrophic explosion. Locals claimed it was haunted, but I'd heard ghost stories about half the places I camped, and they'd never amounted to anything. The first sign that this trip would be different came when I stopped for supplies in town. The grocery store cashier, a wiry man with a thin gray beard, eyed me as he rang up my food. "You're not going near that tunnel, are you?" he asked. "I'm camping in nearby," I said. "Why?" He glanced around, lowering his voice. "Stay away. The ones who go in there don't always come back." I forced a smile, trying to brush it off. "Good thing I'm not planning to explore." The man didn't smile back. "They don't like being disturbed," he said. That evening, I set up camp in a clearing about a mile from the tunnel. The sun dipped below the horizon and the woods grew unnaturally quiet. I told myself it was just the isolation. The silence was part of why I loved these trips, after all. But that night, something felt different. I woke around midnight to the sound of distant whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the voices were too distinct, too human. They were faint, almost pleading, as if someone was calling for help. I stayed in my bed, heart pounding, listening. The whispers seemed to come from all around, but when I looked out the window, the woods were still. The next morning I wrote it off as a bad dream. I'd been working too much, not sleeping enough. It had to be my imagination. The following afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to visit the tunnel. It was about a mile away, an old railroad passage carved into the side of a hill. The entrance loomed like a dark maw, its walls streaked with moss and graffiti. As I stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply, and my breath misted in the air. Water dripped from the ceiling, echoing against the stone walls. I walked about 20 yards in before I stopped. That's when I heard it. Faint voices like the ones from the night before. They were soft, indistinct, but unmistakable. A chill ran down my spine. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I saw lights deeper in the tunnel, small, flickering orbs like lanterns. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed back, but no one responded. The lights vanished and the whispers stopped. I hurried back to the RV, my nerves on edge. This time, I couldn't dismiss what I'd seen. Back at the campsite, I ran into a local. He introduced himself as Carson, an older man with a weathered face and a limp. He carried a bundle of firewood under one arm. "Camping out here alone?" he asked, his tone wary. "Yeah," I said, "just me." Carson glanced toward the tunnel. "You shouldn't be here. That place, it's cursed." I hesitated, then decided to ask. "Ask, what do you mean?" "They call them the Forgotten Ones," Carson said. "Men who died in that tunnel, trapped, crushed, left to rot. They never got a proper burial. They haunt this place, angry, looking for someone to take their place." I laughed nervously. "You really believe that?" Carson's expression didn't change. "You hear voices yet? See the lights?" My blood ran cold. "How did you—" "They always start with voices," he said. "If you hear the shovels, it's already too late." That night I heard them. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, too uneasy to sleep. The generator had been acting up all evening, flickering the lights on and off. As the forest settled into silence, I heard the faint scrape of metal against stone. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, closer. until it sounded like a shovel striking rock just outside the RV. My chest tightened, and I held my breath, listening. Then came the knock. It was soft, deliberate tapping against the side of the RV. My skin crawled as I sat up, grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand. The knocking stopped, but the shoveling continued, fading back into the woods. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. In the morning, I found a symbol etched into the RV door. It looked like a pickaxe crossed with a skull, crudely scratched into the paint. My stomach turned. I decided to pack up and leave. Whatever was happening here, I wanted no part of it. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. Panic set in as I tried to restart it, but the RV wouldn't budge. The generator, too, was dead. I was stranded. Carson found me later that day, sitting outside the RV. He didn't seem surprised when I told him what had happened. "They've marked you," he said grimly. "They want you to join them." "What do I do?" I asked, my voice trembling. Carson handed me a rusted lantern. This belonged to the foreman who caused the explosion. He was a cruel man, made the workers stay even when it wasn't safe. They hate him most of all. "You take this to the heart of the tunnel, to their grave, and maybe they'll let you go." I didn't want to go back, but I had no choice. Carson insisted he couldn't accompany me. "They want you," he said, "not me." As I entered the tunnel, the air grew colder with every step. The whispers started again, louder this time, rising to anguished wails. The lantern flickered in my hand, casting jittery shadows on the walls. Halfway in, I saw them. Figures emerged from the darkness. Their forms were translucent, but unmistakable, miners. Their faces were gaunt and hollow, their eyes glowing like embers. They dragged phantom shovels, their movements jerky, as if trapped in a loop. One of them turned to me, pointing a skeletal finger at the lantern. I understood the message and kept moving. At the heart of the tunnel, I found the unmarked grave, a patch of disturbed earth surrounded by rusted tools. I placed the lantern on the ground, but before I could step back, the leader appeared. He was taller than the others, his form more defined. His face was a mask of rage, and his eyes burned with molten fire. He raised a shovel, and I stumbled backward, tripping over the uneven ground. "I'm sorry," I cried. "I didn't mean to disturb you." The leader's face twisted into a snarl, but he didn't strike. Instead, he pointed at the lantern. I understood. I had to light it. With trembling hands, I struck a match and lit the wick. The flame flared brightly, illuminating the cavern. The wails grew deafening, then stopped. When I looked up, the miners were gone. I made it back to the RV, shaking and exhausted. The engine started without issue, and the generator hummed back to life as if nothing had happened. I left the Hawk Valley that morning, vowing never to return. But the story didn't end there. A month later, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a rusted pickaxe and a note that read, "They never forget." Now, every night, I hear the faint scrape of shovels outside my window, and I know it's only a matter of time before they come for me. Let me know if there's anything else you need. Here's the paragraph exactly as you provided. "My name is Thomas Evans, and I'm 38 years old. This happened last December when I decided to take my RV into Guadalupe Mountains National Park in Texas. I needed a break from everything: work, people, life itself. After years as a war correspondent, I thought I could handle anything. What I found in those mountains made me question everything I believed. The park was as beautiful as I'd hoped. Jagged limestone peaks loomed over the dry, barren landscape, and the December air was crisp, almost cleansing. I parked my RV in a remote spot near McKittrick Canyon, away from the more crowded areas. Isolation was exactly what I wanted: silence, space, and time to think. I spent the first day hiking the trails, taking in the views, and snapping photos for a potential article I'd pitch later. The emptiness was striking. I barely saw anyone else on the trails, and the few people I did meet kept to themselves. It was perfect, or so I thought. On my way back to the RV, I stopped at a small gift shop near the park entrance. The woman behind the counter, Maria, greeted me warmly and struck up a conversation. She was one of those chatty locals who could make you feel at home with just a few words. "You camping here alone?" she asked as she rang up my purchase. "Yeah," I said, "looking for some peace and quiet." Her smile faltered. "You're brave, I'll give you that. "What do you mean?" I asked. She glanced at the window as if checking for something. "You ever hear about the Devil's Grin?" I shook my head, curious but skeptical. "Let me guess. A ghost story?" Her expression darkened. "Not exactly. It's an old legend around these parts. Folks say there's something in these mountains, something that feeds on people's fears. You see a tall figure with a grin too wide for its face. Leave right then and there." I laughed it off, thanked her, and left. Legends were just that, stories. But as I drove back to my campsite, her words stuck with me like a splinter I couldn't quite remove. That night, the wind howled through the mountains, rattling the RV. I sat by the small campfire I'd built, sipping coffee and staring at the stars. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of dry brush. I was about to head inside when I noticed movement near the edge of the firelight. A shadow. Too tall, too thin, it flitted between the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Hello?" I called, shining my flashlight toward the trees. Nothing. Just the wind and the flickering flames. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks after Maria's story. But as I climbed into the RV and locked the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, I hiked deeper into McKittrick Canyon, hoping to shake off the unease from the night before. The sun was bright, and the landscape was stunning. Sheer cliffs, rocky trails, and the occasional cluster of juniper trees. But the sense of isolation was overwhelming. My watch stopped working halfway through the hike, and I realized I'd lost track of time. By the time I made it back to the RV, the sun was already setting, and a strange fog was creeping over the mountains. As I opened the door, I noticed something odd. My hiking boots, which I'd left neatly by the RV steps, were gone. In their place was a single, weathered boot I didn't recognize. That night, the wind returned with a vengeance, slamming against the RV. The heater sputtered and died, leaving me shivering under a pile of blankets. I tried to distract myself by writing, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Maria's warning. Then came the knock. It was faint at first, like someone tapping on the RV's metal siding. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop, but it only grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window. Nothing, just darkness. "No, you couldn't handle it," a voice sneered, low and mocking. It was my voice, but twisted, distorted. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand. "Who's there?" The knocking stopped for a moment. The RV was silent. Then I saw it. A figure stood just beyond the firelight, built tall and impossibly thin. Its limbs too long and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its grin stretched across its entire face, impossibly wide, as if someone had carved it into its skin. Its glowing eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of cold terror wash over me. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, I found scratches on the RV door, deep and jagged. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, but deep down, I knew better. I decided to leave, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. The battery was drained despite being fully charged the day before. My phone was dead too, though I had charged it overnight. Panic set in. I packed a bag and started hiking toward the nearest trailhead, but no matter which path I took, I kept ending up back at the RV. It was as if the mountains themselves were conspiring to trap me. As night fell, the whispers started. They were faint at first, just a low murmur on the wind, but soon they grew louder, forming words, my words. They repeated things I'd written in my articles, things I'd never said aloud. Then they changed, mocking me, twisting my thoughts against me. "You couldn't save them," one voice said, echoing the guilt I'd carried since my time as a correspondent. "You're a coward," another sneered. "Running away won't fix anything." I covered my ears, but the voices only grew louder, more insistent, desperate and broken. I returned to the campfire, hoping the flames would keep whatever it was at bay. The grinning figure emerged from the shadows, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure tilted its head, its grin widening. "You did this to yourself," it said, its voice a distorted mix of my own and others I didn't recognize. It stepped closer, and the fire seemed to dim, the air growing colder. I could feel my mind unraveling, my grip on reality slipping. The entity showed me visions of the people I couldn't save, their faces twisted in anguish. It fed on my guilt, my fear, my despair. Then I remembered Maria's words, "Leave right then and there." I grabbed my notebook, the source of my pride, my ambition, and threw it into the fire. The flames roared to life, and the figure let out a guttural shriek, retreating into the shadows. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. When dawn broke, the RV started as if nothing had happened. I didn't question it. I drove out of the canyon without looking back. I wrote about the trip, but I left out the supernatural details, chalking it up to altitude sickness and overwork. Still, the memory lingers, and every now and then I catch a glimpse of that grin in my dreams. Some legends aren't meant to be tested.